Hi everybody and welcome back. I hope you had a great first week of criminological theory here with me last week and are very excited to jump into our discussion about biological and biosocial theories. These theories are not without controversy, and specifically biological theories have had influence over some of the worst, over the worst genetic testing projects we've seen in the last 100 or so years. With the early biological theories, they were really based on the idea that people were predisposed toward criminal behavior based solely upon their genetic makeup. And in other words, you were pretty much born a criminal or you weren't born a criminal. And I mean, it's a little bit more complex than that, but generally that's the basic premise behind biological theories. Later, biosocial theories, and that's what we're going to discuss in part today, believe that biology is one part of it, but it's really just playing a role to an extent, and that there's a larger phenomenon happening. So the environment is part of it, your biology is part of it, the area in which you were raised in, the area in which you were born in, your family environment, all of these different things come together, and they're really playing a role in whether you're going to be predisposed towards criminal behavior. So it's not just biology alone when we're talking about biosocial criminology. So really what we're talking about here, is it just the nature debate or nature question, or is it the nature versus nurture debate to a certain extent? So what we're going to do today is really take a look at both sides of the aisle, and we're going to do so by looking first at classical biological theories, and then we're going to make our way towards the biosocial ones. So to begin with, we have to really go back pretty far, and we're going to start by taking a look at Lombroso's work. And Lombroso, as you probably already know, is the individual that we credit as being the father of biological criminology. And Lombroso was really under the mindset that your genetic makeup was the only thing that determined your predisposition into criminality. There's no rational choice. There's no law that's going to deter you if you fell into one of his criminal categories, and I'll tell you what those are in just a few seconds here. Then there's pretty much no hope for you. And you might remember Lombroso by now. His ideas were pretty scientifically advanced for the time period in which he was promoting them. But today, if we look back, they're rather absurd in nature. In his original work, what he called The Criminal Man, Lombroso published his findings in which he was really describing the scientific process by which he conducted these measurements to determine the individuals who met the criteria for criminality. And he did this by measuring things like head size, nose, the width of your nose, the length of your forehead, how pronounced your eyebrows were your eye sockets sort of sunken in. And once you died, he did all sorts of different experiments to your brain to try and figure out who was sharing the same criteria for these traits that were sort of leading forward into the idea of criminality. So what he was basically doing, he had an arrangement with several local prisons and some of the mental asylums. Sorry, excuse me. My little dog is wanting a little attention, so we'll just throw him on my lap here and carry on. Okay, so anyway, what he had was an arrangement with local prisons and some of the mental asylums, and these institutions would send him some of their dead bodies. After the inmates had died, they would send the bodies over to Lombroso, and he would begin to conduct his experiments on these dead individuals. And here's the rub, right? So if you're trying to predict criminality, or you're trying to figure out what types of characteristics or traits lead towards criminality, you probably want to have a more diverse sample than just a bunch of criminals, right? And those individuals who have mental deficiencies, because that was part of what he was trying to promote as well. So if you're only examining criminals and those who are considered mentally infirm for the time, then really what you're doing is creating your own self-fulfilling prophecy, right? I'm taking a bunch of criminals and I'm trying to figure out what makes them criminal. And I'm not comparing them at all to people who don't display the same types of criminal tendencies. If by chance you ever find yourself in Italy, and I hope you do one day, I've never been, but I'd like to go, you can actually go visit the Museum of Criminal Anthropology, which proudly displays all of Lombroso's work. While he was alive, he played a large part in trying to get the museum off the ground, and he has donated all kinds of crazy weird things to this museum. And on display you can find more than 400 different skulls that he actually used in his testing, and there's a bunch of death masks that are present from the prison inmates who were hanged, and you can even see Lombroso's own head on display because he donated it after he died. And he had a colleague perform all of the same types of medical tests and experiments that he would perform on these prison inmates. He had his colleague perform them on his own person. And what's really kind of weird about it, but also kind of morbidly interesting, is the idea that his colleague severed his head from his body and it's perfectly preserved in a glass container. So it's just kind of like floating there. It's in the museum, and you could go and actually see Lombroso's perfectly preserved head if that's your thing. I mean, for me, I totally go, because who doesn't want to see a perfectly preserved head? But for some people, it's not their thing. But for me, I would definitely go. So long story short, if you can't make it to Italy, I encourage you to look up the museum online, because there's tons of pictures and things that are taken directly from the museum itself, and so you can go explore all you want. So I definitely encourage you to go do exactly that. Okay, so anyway, back on track, right? I always get a little sidetracked when I find something exciting going on, but back on track and back to the science of it all. So as we're talking about biological theories that are born simply from Lombroso, what he would basically do is, after taking all of the measurements and conducting all the tests that he needed to conduct, Lombroso comes up with this category structure that includes these different typologies, like the born criminal and the insane criminal and the criminaloid. And the born criminal was this individual who was predestined to commit crime. He would have no other option in life other than to violate the law, and it was just sort of out of his control. There was an inevitability that he was going to do just that. And Lombroso categorized this individual as being sort of the throwback, right? He's the atavistic type of man, in which he's a throwback to this earlier type of primitive man, if you will. And Lombroso said that this type of person could be identified by specific stigmatas, which were described as almost being like ape-like in nature. So larger lips and ears, a very pronounced eyebrow, and these sunken eye sockets like we talked about before, very high pronounced cheekbones. Your arms were much longer than the normal person, and a few other things that he categorized within this typology. But Lombroso said in order to be a true born criminal, as he called it, you had to have at least 5 of these characteristics. The insane criminal was someone who was classified with having a mental deficiency, and at the time they might be called an idiot or an imbecile or somebody who was epileptic or psychotic, as Akers and colleagues describe in Chapter 3. This person would not have the same stigmata as the born criminal, but again, criminal behavior is typically a given due to the lack of control that is presented from the mental deficiencies. And then finally, our criminaloid type of person is it's described as someone who has just like a little bit more control over their actions, but are typically ruled by their emotions, and they're very quick to give into their desires, right? So if the right circumstances were to come along, I would have no problem committing a crime, and I would do so without question. So as Lombroso is collecting all of this data on the physical attributes of these offenders, then we have to consider what these suggested policy changes would be based on this theory. If we were still using this theory today as a way to try and predict criminal behavior, right, the policy recommendation or the policy change would sort of fit in with this whole idea of the eugenics argument, right? If your child is born and falls into one of these categories, should we then simply remove the problem, right? And I know that sounds rather harsh, but if we're taking Lombroso's theory as scientifically valid, that's going to solve the crime problem, right? If this theory actually had some merit, then removing the problem individuals would solve the crime problem. So this is, again, not something that anybody really advocates for today, but if you think about it, it's really more of an advanced theory that has some sort of scientific backing for the mid-1800s. So much so that Charles Goring advances Lombroso's theory in England in the early 1900s, and then that one specific German group in the 1930s and 40s decided they're going to apply basically these same principles and scientific measurements to groups that they felt were genetically inferior to the Aryan race. And that's as far as I'll go, right? But at the same time, people are putting a lot of stock into the idea that if you could genetically perfect the human race, we'd have a lot less problems, right? And while there are many problems with just the purely biological theories, one of the major criticisms is the idea of predestined behavior and the lack of human control. It's just much too simple of an idea and too black and white of a concept. It definitely takes away the idea of self-control and human will, right? However, the idea of biology playing a role in behavior cannot be thrown out altogether. And biosocial criminology, rather, is rooted in the purely biological theories, but it's taking into account all the other things that Lombroso forgot. Right? So biosocial criminology is including things like environment and social structural factors that are helping to influence our behaviors. So it's not just the genetic argument anymore. Now, as it's described in the Barnes, Boutwell, and Beaver piece, biosocial criminology is really a composite field that's taking many different things into account, including things like evolutionary criminology, biological criminology, behavioral genetics, molecular genetics, and neurocriminology into account. So it's really this melting pot of different disciplines that's coming along to advance the arguments found in biosocial theories. So when we're talking about things like evolutionary criminology, that field is really providing us with the explanations for some of the more terrible crimes that we commit, such as things like murder, infanticide, or patricide. And over the millennia, there has really been an evolutionary need for some of us to commit some of these crimes, especially when we're talking like way back to our ancestors. And this need has become ingrained in us as well. But we're not off, all of us are not off killing our parents, right, as a way to then advance our own power and station. We don't need to do it anymore, but it was something that our ancestors used to do, and as a way of sort of advancing their own status, right? Modern biological theories or criminological theories take into account more than just the size of our foreheads, the way that Lombroso used to do so. Instead, the more modern biological theorists are focusing on things like testosterone levels, right, in males, and this whole chemical balance that's taking place that is strongly linked to aggression. And really what this is talking about is maybe a potential explanation between the disjunct that exists between male and female criminality. Behavioral genetics focuses a little bit more on the classical elements found in Lombrosian criminology, but it's using twin testing to see if there's anything to the whole genetic makeup theory. And in twin studies, the genetic makeup is 100% the same in identical twins. So what you have is a controlled pair, right? Then you can manipulate the social structure and the environment to see if that is influencing behavior. And normally this is not something that is purposefully done, but instead what scientists sort of rely on is a pair of twins that have already been separated traditionally through the adoption process, or they're looking at other siblings who have been separated through adoption as well. And then they're looking to see if twin A was raised in this environment and twin B was raised in this environment, were there any differences in behavior, right? So the twin studies is a large part of helping that field of science advance. Molecular genetics is working to see if there are any specific genes that can be isolated to see if somewhere along the line we can find what researchers are hopeful to call the CRIJ gene. And there's been a lot of molecular testing taking place to see sort of what genetic sequences are present in those individuals who have certain antisocial or deviant behavioral traits, who might be gang affiliated or maybe have been prone to violent behaviors in the past. And for me, this is one of the more interesting things that are happening right now. You know, can you imagine it, right? Try and picture it. If they can figure out the genetic sequence that says if your child is born with this sequence, then they're going to be predisposed to criminal behavior, right? That is a huge, huge statement for science to be able to make. And of course, we can't always talk in absolutes, but it's a pretty scary notion to be able to say your child has been born with this, and they're predisposed to engaging in violent or criminal behavior. And researchers are pretty close comparatively to how close they were in previous decades. But they're on the verge of finding these sequences, and one day maybe we'll be testing our children to see if they have this predisposition towards crime in the same way that we're testing for the Alzheimer's genes or for BRCA markers for breast cancer, right? And this is just a really wild and crazy idea, and the whole idea of science playing that much of a role in criminality is kind of a scary notion if you think about it, right? Okay, so biosocial criminology then is taking all of these things and putting them together, and because science is finally getting to the point where we need it to be, biosocial criminology as a discipline is a relatively young field compared to some of the behavioral theories that are more well known and that we'll discuss in the next upcoming weeks. And researchers have really only dug deep into these issues and published on these types of theories only in the last couple of decades. But right now, it's one of the hottest things to study within the discipline. But the problem is, because it's so reliant on more of the hard sciences, you need a lot of funding to be able to conduct this type of research, and it's awfully difficult for a humanities researcher to get that type of funding without some sort of connection to a hard science. So students who want to study this type of discipline specifically, they're attending universities in which they can be mentored specifically in the field of biosocial criminology. And really, it's becoming a game changer for many people's careers. And if it's continuing the way that scientists predict it to be going, it really could have the potential to just bust the field wide open in the years to come. Okay, so what I'm going to do, because this is a very complicated style of theory, I'm not going to try and overwhelm you too much, and I feel like there's some other theories that we can get into a little bit more detail with. So I'm going to end here for this week, and next week we're going to pick up with the beginnings of some of the more social structural types of theories, and we're going to focus on one of my favorites that we will talk about this semester, social learning theory. And next week I'll tell you why it's one of my favorites. But we're going to start with Sutherland's differential association theory next week, and then we're going to segue into Aker's social learning theory. And this, as I just said to you, is one of my favorites, but beyond my personal connection with it, it's one of the biggest and most empirically valid theories in criminology, so it's very widely used and very much fits in with this idea of contemporary theory, which is what we're pressing for in this class. Okay, so I just want to say thank you for your time and your attention today, and I hope that you all have a great rest of the day, and I will see you next week when we start exploring social learning theory. So thanks everybody. Bye!